In this lesson, we're going to discuss what you should know to really make the most of this course. So first, let's take a look at the fundamentals of how the web really works. Now we start with a web browser. Now this is simply an application which knows how to send an HTTP request, get a response, and render the return code as a graphical web page. Now to most people, a web browser is simply that blue E icon on their desktop. But there are many alternatives such as Firefox, Chrome, Safari and Opera. So someone types a web address into their browser, or perhaps they click a link from an email, but ultimately this sends a request for a web page. Now that request is routed onto the internet, where magical pixies do their work and find out where it needs to go. Now ultimately the request ends up at a server, which knows that it needs to return a web page. Now it might fetch a static file or run a program written using PHP, .NET, Ruby, Python or any other language, but ultimately it generates HTML. Now that HTML code is returned back via the internet to your web browser. Now the browser understands HTML and it recognises commands to fetch other files such as images, style sheets and of course JavaScript code. Now all these resources are retrieved using similar HTTP requests. But once it has all the components, it can display a completed web page. Now in this course we'll primarily be discussing JavaScript code which runs client-side. Now that's JavaScript applications which are written to run within the browser, over here. But you should also be aware that it's possible to run JavaScript code on the server so it can process input, store data and generate HTML. Now perhaps the most well-known implementation is Node.js. It's a fairly new system which uses the same JavaScript engine as you'll find in the Google Chrome browser. Now the JavaScript you'll learn in this course can be used server-side, but we'll mainly be concentrating on client-side code because that's applicable no matter what server technology you're using. But if you're eager to find out more, head over to nodejs.org and you'll find downloads and tutorials. Now it'll help if you have a basic understanding of HTML before attempting this course. In these videos we'll be using HTML5, but it really doesn't matter if you prefer HTML4 or XHTML1. Now in essence, HTML is responsible for your content. That's the text and images. Now we mark this content using special tags which are denoted with greater and less than signs. Now in this case we have a P tag, which is a paragraph. Now you'll also note a closing P tag, which is identical to the opening one except it has a slash. Now it's always important to close your tags to mark the end of an item. Now HTML has many tags for headings, bullet lists, images, sections and forms. It'll help if you know a few, but most are fairly self-explanatory, and we'll go through them as they crop up. Now any tag can be assigned an ID. So in this case we've assigned an ID with the name of widget. Now that ID must be a unique name within the page. In other words, there can only be one tag which has the ID of widget. Now that's often because you'll only ever have one widget on the page in the same way as you'll only ever have one header or one footer. Now tags can also have classes. Now classes are similar to IDs except they can apply to any number of elements. So for example, we might want multiple paragraphs which are actually error messages. In that case we would assign a class of perhaps error. And remember that this name can be whatever you choose. Now CSS stands for cascading style sheets and they control the layout. In other words, that's how the browser positions and styles the HTML content within your page. Now a CSS rule always starts with a selector. These can be quite complex, but in this example we're simply targeting the paragraph tag. Now a set of rules or properties follow in squiggly braces. So in this case we're saying that whenever we encounter a paragraph tag, we want the text to be aligned left and we want the colour to be black. Now we can also target elements which have a specific ID, and we do this with a hash followed by the ID name. Now remember there can only be one element on our page with the ID of widget. And in this case, we're just adding a border with a 1 pixel solid blue outline. And finally, we can target elements by their class. To do this, we use a period followed by the class name that we chose. Now in this case, we've been a little bit more specific and said that we only want to apply these styles to any p tag which has a class of error. And we've set the color to red, which will override the color of black that we specified up here. Now JavaScript is a computer programming language. It controls the functionality and it allows you to add interactive components to your page. Now, first of all, don't worry, you don't need to understand this code right now. You'll certainly find this course easier if you have experience programming in other languages. And you'll probably be able to skip some of the earlier sections because many of the concepts such as variables, arrays, loops and functions will already be familiar to you. But on the whole, we'll assume that you've never written a program in your life. And that's not necessarily a disadvantage either. You may actually find some aspects easier to grasp because you won't have preconceptions formed by other languages. Now you should note that JavaScript does things a little differently. It's incredibly flexible and expressive. But that often confuses developers who have programmed in other languages. So let's recap. A web page is created using 3 components. Your content is defined in HTML. Your layout and styles are defined in CSS. And your functionality is defined in JavaScript. Now you should try and keep these as separate as possible, but in reality there is some crossover and overlap. For example, you may need to define an extra element or an ID in your HTML just because you want to hook in some functionality or styles. Also, you'll find that modern HTML5 and CSS3 techniques, such as animation, allow you to implement effects which would have required JavaScript a few years ago.